Doran Martell is one of the most interesting and mysterious characters in A Song of Ice and Fire. House Martell doesn't become a significant part of the main storyline until the introduction of Oberyn Martell in A Storm of Swords. But his older brother still remains in the background, the metaphorical grass that had been hiding the Red Viper for years. But it's clear that House Martell is set to play a bigger role in the story going forward. And after Arianne's failed Queenmaker plot, fans assume that the Prince of Dorne's true plans and motivations have finally been revealed. However, that assumption may be incorrect. After Arianne accuses her father of attempting to cut her out of the Martell line of succession, he ultimately tells her why he has spent years foiling her attempts to agree upon a betrothal and only offered her horrific options for a potential marriage match, as well as why he was apparently planning on his eldest son Quentyn succeeding him as the leader of Dorne, rather than Arianne taking the seat which was legally and rightfully hers. Doran explains that his plans for his daughter were not to rule Dorne, but to ascend to the Iron Throne as the wife of Viserys Targaryen. Doran says that he had been secretly plotting for a Targaryen restoration for years, that he had covertly arranged a betrothal between Viserys and Arianne, an agreement that stipulated that in exchange for their marriage, House Martell would support Viserys' claim to the Seven Kingdoms. Arianne had assumed for years that her father hated her or had no faith in her, and that's why he planned on skipping her in the line of succession. But the supposed reality is that he was planning on getting Arianne and House Martell back on the Iron Throne. However, Doran's claim of supporting a Targaryen restoration is more than a little suspicious. The first and most obvious indication that he's lying about his ultimate plans is, frankly, that he's a liar. He has been lying about and concealing his master plans for over a decade, so the assumption that he's suddenly telling Arianne the truth is more than a little dubious. Even further than that, one of his particular excuses for not telling Arianne about the plot is that he felt that she was too willful and was afraid that she wouldn't keep this plan a secret. However, when he actually tells Arianne about this plan, she's done something outrageously willful that had disastrous consequences when she attempted to crown Myrcella as the Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. And as a result of her estrangement from her father, she's closer to her cousins than ever. So, the notion that this incredibly secretive man, who offered up these particular excuses for not telling his daughter the truth, is now finally being honest when she's taken her behavior to its greatest extreme, is more than a little odd. But even putting the illogic of telling Arianne the truth after her Queenmaker debacle aside, the notion that Doran's master plan has always been to put a Targaryen and his daughter onto the Iron Throne seems doubtful. Doran has generally displayed himself to be a considerate and careful leader, and unlike many other Westerosi lords, he doesn't seem to want to punish an entire family for the transgressions of certain individuals. However, he and Oberyn apparently devoted a lot of time in the interim since their sister's death, planning to avenge her murder and destroy Tywin Lannister. Oberyn was literally willing to risk his life for the sake of that revenge, and it doesn't seem as if Doran was unaware or disagreeable about this plan. So the notion that he would have this much of a grudge against the Lannisters, but also seek a Targaryen restoration, is completely contradictory. Yes, Viserys and Daenerys clearly aren't responsible for the actions of their brother and father. However, the reality of the situation is, if Rhaegar hadn't abandoned Elia and their children in order to abscond with Lyanna, and if Aerys hadn't used Elia, Aegon, and Rhaenys as hostages to keep Dorne aligned with the Targaryens, then Doran's sister, niece, and nephew likely would have survived the rebellion. Or even if they hadn't, at least they could take some comfort in the idea that the Targaryens did what they could to protect Elia. But that's clearly not the case. And someone as diligent as Doran certainly would have thought this entire situation through. So he should naturally have misgivings about the fact that the Targaryen obsession with their own exceptionalism got someone that he loved killed. And he would naturally be suspicious that Viserys and Daenerys would likely have the same ideas about Targaryens being superior to all others. Clearly he didn't know much about the remaining Targaryens or their feelings about their lost dynasty. But he doesn't seem like the type of person who would take that kind of risk without knowing what he's getting his own children into. From what we've all seen of Viserys and Daenerys, becoming their significant other would almost certainly not be beneficial for Arianne or Quentyn personally. But even putting aside the dangers of the Targaryen mentality, and what threat that could pose to the Martells, one of the fundamental flaws of making Arianne Viserys' queen, or Quentyn Daenerys' king, is the simple fact that the laws of the other kingdoms are not the laws of Dorne. And the advantage that these matches would offer would not grant them, Arianne in particular, more power than she would have had in Dorne. Elia was put in danger for many reasons, but one of the most heartbreaking aspects of her situation is that she was a rare Westerosi woman who was born into a place of significant power, and becoming Rhaegar's wife essentially robbed her of that agency. Elia obviously wasn't the heir to Dorne, but she was from a region where women have their own autonomy. Therefore, when Elia became Rhaegar's wife, she lost her power and influence as an individual, and belonged to Rhaegar. And if Arianne were to become Viserys' wife, she would be in the same situation. Yes, in name she would be the queen of the Seven Kingdoms, but the king is still the one who holds all the power. And historically speaking, Targaryen kings have not been interested in sharing that power with anyone. And although Quentyn might have had a shred more credibility if he were to marry Dany, she is still the real ruler, and she's still the one with the dragons. And then, there's the dragons. Doran has sent Quentyn off to Essos in an attempt to gain Dany's hand in marriage, and this is an incredibly suspicious move as well. From a foundational standpoint, House Martell has the most historical enmity with House Targaryen out of any other family in Westeros. And the Rhoynar literally fled Essos and landed in Westeros, specifically to escape the threat of dragons. So the notion that Doran, a man who is especially reluctant to potentially cause any collateral damage in his plots for revenge, would be angling to bring the Dragon Queen to Westeros seems very contradictory to everything that the books have told readers about Doran and House Nymeros Martell. And those are simply the misgivings that he should have from a historical standpoint, not from a personal one. Putting aside the long grudge between the Valyrians and Rhoynar, Doran has some first-hand experience with the Targaryens themselves. And yes, Rhaella seems to have been a kind and caring individual. But Aerys was a racist lunatic, and Rhaegar was a self-obsessed windbag who didn't care if Elia lived or died, so long as she gave him heirs as quickly as possible. So, would the exceptionally family-oriented Doran put his own children at risk in a situation where they would have very little power in a marriage with people that Doran himself is unfamiliar with, just because he somehow thinks that these choices would allow him to get revenge against Tywin Lannister, a man who's already dead by the time Doran tells Arianne about this plot in the first place? But what's even more interesting about Doran's alleged plan to align with the Targaryens is that simply, the proof is not in the pudding. Yes, according to him, there have apparently been some kinds of communications to arrange this betrothal. But this is incredibly suspect. First off, it could be nothing more than coincidence, but it's interesting that the two people who supposedly signed this secret pact are both dead. And the Sea Lord of Braavos that bore witness to this pact isn't particularly named. But considering Dany's focus on her eviction from the Braavosi house with the Red Door, which many speculate may be the home of the Sea Lord of Braavos himself, it seems safe to assume that this witnessing Sea Lord is also dead. So essentially, we have to go on Doran's word alone that this deal was brokered, and there's no one around to confirm or deny its veracity. But even more tellingly, Viserys is now dead as well, and he died without ever mentioning an alliance with the Martells or a betrothal with Arianne. One could probably surmise, based on that fact alone, that Viserys didn't actually know about this pact, which is extremely strange if it's actually legitimate. Sir Willem Darry is the one who signed on behalf of Viserys, and he both seemed to be the primary guardian of the surviving Targaryens, and didn't seem to die particularly suddenly or unexpectedly. So the notion that Sir Willem would not have told young Viserys about his betrothal and allies in Dorne before he died and just let the two children he had devoted his life to caring for become beggars makes absolutely no sense. We don't particularly know much about Willem Darry, aside from Dany's seemingly vague and somewhat unreliable memories of him. However, one thing that can be unequivocally stated is that Darry was not in the position to promise a king's hand in marriage to anyone anyway. And fascinatingly, neither was Oberyn, the person that Doran sent as his envoy to allegedly broker this deal. Yes, Oberyn and Doran are clearly close. But while Doran is alive, Oberyn can't truly promise his niece or nephews to anyone. He can claim that he's working on Doran's behalf, but unless Doran himself gives the go-ahead, then the deal is tenuous. And it's very interesting that, assuming that this pact even happened in the first place, that Doran knowingly made an agreement that he could essentially bail out on if he chose. And it was an agreement that wouldn't be unenforceable unless Doran ultimately decided that he wanted to go through with it. But putting the obvious escape hatches that seem to have been built in this secret pact aside, the experience of Viserys and Daenerys seems to indicate that the Martells are no allies of the Targaryens on its own. Because yes, House Martell wouldn't be smart to do anything publicly to rebel against the Baratheons once Robert has taken the throne for himself. But Doran could have done a great deal to help Viserys and Daenerys throughout their entire lives, and he has seemingly done absolutely nothing. In fact, the Targaryens don't even seem to know who he is, as Doran himself isn't mentioned in any of Dany's chapters until she's introduced to Quentyn. House Martell is one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in Westeros, but Doran's claims about aiming for a Targaryen restoration are very interesting because he has more power and connections in the Free Cities than possibly every other family in the Seven Kingdoms. He is literally married to Malario of Norvos, a wife that, yes, he's estranged from, but who literally lives in the Free City of Norvos. Thus, if Doran wanted to put Viserys on the throne, and wanted to ensure that the remaining Targaryens were loyal to the Martells above all others, then he was in a better position to do that than anyone else in Westeros. He could have easily kept Viserys and Daenerys hidden in Essos, and had them raised to think the best of the Martells. And yet, he doesn't do that. And if Viserys' reputation as a beggar king has any merit, Doran didn't even have any agents working secretly on his behalf to help the Targaryens at all. In fact, although Dany only briefly recalls her journeys across the Free Cities as a child, she specifically does not mention ever being in Norvos with Viserys. And again, although he and Malario are estranged, considering her feelings about children and family, it seems unlikely that she or her family would be unwilling to secretly shelter Dany and Viserys if Doran had asked. And that mostly brings us to the present storyline. Doran has told Arianne that he wished to wed her to Viserys. She's now en route to investigate young Griff, and Quentyn has been sent off to gain Daenerys' hand in marriage. So in theory, it would appear that Doran is going all out to ensure that House Martell and Targaryen are united again. But is that his sincere intention? Because once again, although Doran isn't the most mobile person in Westeros, he's sending his children off to arrange betrothals or agreements that they essentially have no legal right to offer. Sure, they could theoretically marry Aegon or Daenerys if they wanted to. But the appeal of these marriages is the allegiance of Dorne that comes with them, and the only Martell who can truly offer the allegiance of Dorne is Doran himself. And it's entirely possible that Doran simply wants to keep the utmost secrecy about these goals. However, someone as secretive as Doran would seemingly know the difference between secrecy and stupidity. And to put it bluntly, the plans that he has for these backdoor deals are extremely half-assed and just plain awful. Sending Arianne to investigate the legitimacy of young Griff makes sense. And if he discovers that his sister's son is truly alive, that will understandably change his perspective on things. But Quentyn's trip to Essos seems utterly moronic and doomed to fail. Doran is sending his son to Meereen to woo Daenerys, and he sends Quentyn with a dangerously small party, and without a way of even getting to Meereen. He has to go to Essos and just figure out how to get there, and get a face-to-face meeting with the Queen, which is baffling. When Quentyn arrives in Essos, things in the area of Slaver's Bay are at a near standstill because of Dany's conquering, and Daenerys has obviously been at it for quite a while. And a war veteran like Doran should know that journeying through a region at war is nearly impossible. And he sends Quentyn with no real help or even any good ideas of what to do. So, the notion that Doran has sent Quentyn to Essos with the intention of even making his way to Daenerys is more than a little suspect. But let's just assume that he has a lot of faith in Quentyn and somehow thinks that his plain, frog-faced son and his ragtag group of companions will snag an audience with Daenerys, and he will convince her to abandon her throne in Meereen and come to Dorne. This plan already seems less than half-baked, but what is Quentyn's big clincher to convince Dany that she should come with him and marry him? The pact between Sir Willem and Oberyn. Except, the probability that Daenerys or anyone with her would even know what Sir Willem's signature looks like is incredibly unlikely. And the notion that a reigning queen would take the promise of her much lower-born childhood caretaker as an unbreakable agreement, and then agree that the betrothal between Viserys and Arianne should justify a betrothal between Dany and Quentyn is ridiculous. And unsurprisingly, Quentyn is literally ridiculed when Daenerys finally meets with him. Daenerys laughs at him, Daario is rude as hell, and even Sir Barristan thinks it's embarrassingly obvious that a young girl in a position of power like Dany would never want to marry mud like Quentyn. But Quentyn, who is terrified of failing his father and is determined to become the hero of his own story, refuses to return home without Dany. And for some batshit crazy reason, he decides that taming a dragon is the way to win her over. This is obviously the choice that gets him horrifically killed. But if Quentyn hadn't been burned by Rhaegal, then what would have happened? He would have returned home with nothing, aside from a bizarre flop attempt to get at Daenerys at all, or a bizarre flop attempt to get Daenerys to agree to marry him. And anyone over the age of 20 with a lick of common sense could have seen this outcome coming. So what does this say about Doran and his intentions? Ultimately, it seems like he wants to present a thin veneer of allegiance with House Targaryen, when in reality, he wants anything but. Because, as George R.R. Martin has said himself, whether it's Syvas or the Game of Thrones, Doran plays to win. And all of the plays that he's made in service of House Targaryen seem intentionally destined to fail. But then the question obviously presents itself. House Martell has no real alliances with other great houses, and it seems like their attempts to create a connection with House Targaryen are failures and frauds. So what is it that Doran's actually after? Although it's hard to say, based on his own lived experience as well as the history of Dorne, the obvious possible answer seems to be that he simply wants Dorne to be independent from the Seven Kingdoms again. The Dornish resisted the rule of House Targaryen and joining the rest of the kingdoms for hundreds of years. And when House Martell ventured back into continental politics with Elya's marriage to Rhaegar, it was an absolute disaster. Dorne is extremely culturally and physically distinct from the rest of the Seven Kingdoms, and it largely operates independently of the Iron Throne anyway. Given Doran's desire to mitigate the amount of fallout that the people that he rules over experience as a result of Westerosi politics, it seems to make the most sense that he would simply want to remove himself and the rest of the Dornish from these politics completely. But, in order to do that, he'd likely need the consent of the Iron Throne, which is why he seemingly coincidentally creates connections with those he believes will rule and be in power, without actually making those connections permanent or giving away his own family members to another house. When the Lannisters were on the throne, he agreed to a betrothal with his mortal enemies, and now that it seems like the Targaryens will return, he's creating positive relationships with them that don't really require a lot of follow-through or potential sacrifice on his end. That is, if Quentyn hadn't been so doggedly determined to make his father's supposed wishes come true. If Doran Martell truly is playing the Game of Thrones in order to win, then the obvious question is, what winning means to him? And although that's only up to speculation at this point, it seems undeniably clear that his notion of winning would not be having one of his children at the potential mercy of yet another Targaryen, nor would it be a Targaryen restoration in general. But regardless of the end goal, it will be fascinating to see what House Martell's true aims are, and whether or not they achieve them. But what do you think? Is Doran Martell a genuine ally of House Targaryen? Or is he just faking it? Leave your comments and opinions below. And if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.